Now, President Trump has been back in power for just 43 days. In that time, he's caused an upheaval in U.S. domestic and international politics. There's been his plan to relocate 2 million Palestinians and form a so-called Riviera in Gaza, a plan that's been welcomed by Israel, but rejected by the Arab world. He's had a dramatic public row in front of the TV cameras at the White House with Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky and reversed US policy by stopping military aid to Kyiv. He's angered China, Canada and Mexico with high tariffs and infuriated Canada's Prime Minister, who now accuses him of wanting to annex the country. He's pulled out of the Paris Climate Agreement and rolled back decades of achievement in climate talks. He's panicked much of Europe with talk of more levies on European goods while seemingly wavering on decades-long security agreements. And he's stopped vast amounts of American aid going to some of the world's most needy, many of whom may likely die as a result. And inside the US, and in the name of getting Americans value for money, he's promised to axe huge numbers of government jobs. So, to put it mildly, an extraordinary start to the Trump presidency, and it's not even 100 days yet. Well, for more on all this, I'm joined now on the line from London by the Republican strategist and chair of Republicans Overseas UK, Greg Swenson. Greg, thank you very much indeed for joining us. Great to see you again. And you are, of course, a big supporter of President Trump. I mean, were you pleased with what you heard in that speech to Congress? Did he hit it out of the park for you?
Yeah, I think he did in many respects, Charles, and it's good to see you again. But yeah, he really did. I think, in many ways it was a victory lap, not regarding winning the election. That's sort of old news now, from the election being in November. But in the first 43 days, he's really hit the ground running. So is the rest of the administration. So, it's a lot to be proud of, and it's not very typical for Republican or even Democrat presidents to do those kind of speeches, but I think this is a very different president. He's much more, disruptive in so many ways. So I thought the speech was very well received. It polled really well. 76% of the people that viewed it had favorable things to say about it or approved of the speech, and only 23% disapproved.
Well, I suppose it depends on which poll you're looking at, but I mean, you mentioned the issue of his rather unorthodox speech there. I mean, looking at the reaction so far, it certainly sounded like a campaign speech to many people, down to the point of, at one point, criticizing Kamala Harris, the Democratic candidate he defeated, and repeatedly castigating Joe Biden, who is, of course, no longer president. I mean, do you agree with those who say that it was confusingly different from your normal presidential speech to Congress, which is typically conciliatory and tends to lay down the legislative agenda for the year?
Yeah, I think you're right, Charles. This was different, and I don't think it was conciliatory. I think in many ways, this is a counter-revolution. It's not just a revolution. The last 4 years in the Biden administration was quite revolutionary. The rapid expansion of government spending, the opening of the borders, the complete ignorance regarding inflation. And so, and then of course you had all this insane wokery, men playing in women's sports, and things got so radical. So I think it's very valid that the president still refers to some of the things that Vice President Harris and President Biden did, because we have to remind people that this is a bit of a counter-revolution. So, it's not normal. This is not a normal president. So I'm not surprised with the way he came out of the gates last night, in many ways reminding people of how bad things were. It's really designed to keep people enthused about what he's doing, because so much of what he's doing is radical. It's trying to shake up Washington, trying to cut back on radical and wasteful spending, some of which is fraudulent, is really important. And I think he needs to keep that momentum going. So look, I think there was that, of course, the partisan response, from the Democrats, but the Democrats are polling at 30. It's the all-time low for polling numbers for the Democrat Party right now. So they don't really have a lot to lean on, except they're being against Donald Trump. I'm not sure that will work. And half of the audience last night were independents and Democrats. It wasn't just a partisan audience. So you have great approval numbers. And not only was the speech well received, Charles, but the things that he's doing in Washington are polling in the 60s and 70s. It's really unprecedented. Now, President Trump himself is polling in the low 50s. That's pretty good considering it's a 50-50 country. And his top polling numbers were 47 in his first term. That was his absolute peak. So to be at 50 to 53 is impressive, but more importantly, the actions that he's taking are polling in the 60s and 70s.
He said in that speech that he intends to get rid of America's vast deficit and balance the books. But at the same time, he's talking about tax cuts. I mean, that seems difficult to manage. How do you get those two together?
Yeah, it's an easy one, Charles, and it's been proven time and time again. When you lower tax rates, the tax revenues go up. I know it's counterintuitive in many respects, but it's the classic Laffer curve, named after Arthur Laffer, who's still around and advising the Trump administration. But he was a key input into the Reagan Revolution back in the 80s, which ended up yielding higher tax revenues. When you lower taxes and, more importantly, or perhaps as importantly, deregulate, cut back on the regulatory burden on the private economy and on individual people, you tend to get much higher economic growth and higher wage growth. That's what happened with Trump in his first term. You had significant wage growth in the last 2 years after his economic policies took effect. That ends up yielding higher taxes. Tax revenues in America set records in 2019 through the last year. So we don't have a tax problem. We have a spending problem. But funny enough, when you do cut the rates, tax revenues ultimately go up as the economy kicks in. So it's quite sensible to do that. Now, getting to a balanced budget, that's going to be a challenge, given that right now the annual deficits under Biden were $2 trillion a year. And even under Trump, they were close to 1 trillion. So, granted, you can argue Biden's were a lot worse than they were, but I think they have a long way to go to cut that much spending. But the tax cuts will be a good start, or the cut in the rate of taxation will end up yielding higher tax revenues.
And just staying with that theme of the economy, because he did talk about growing the economy, and yet in that speech he admitted that the tariffs that he's putting on Mexico, Canada, and China and others are going to lead to some difficulties for the American public, because it will lead to considerably higher prices. I mean, how do you square the two?
Yeah, it's a great question, Charles, and this is somewhat unprecedented. We haven't really used tariffs aggressively. I mean, he did in his first term, especially on China, and there was really no noticeable inflation from those tariffs. So we don't have a lot of data on the effects there. So I think what he's suggesting is there might be that risk of certain items, certain prices going up, but that will be offset by the tax reform and deregulation, which, especially the deregulation allows the private economy to generate more productivity. And so it's really going to be a series of offsets, maybe, and again, I say maybe, a slight increase in inflation from tariffs, but a significant reduction in inflationary pressure from tax reform and deregulation. And the most important thing there, Charles, is deregulating the energy industry, because the energy industry affects prices in the entire economy. It's an oil-based economy, as most of developed countries are. And so that's what was really painful in the Biden years. Joe Biden's hostility to the energy sector, cutting off pipeline developments, cutting off new leases on oil and gas development, that made energy prices go up significantly higher. And I don't mean, on the margins, 5% 10%. Energy prices were up 60% before Russia invaded Ukraine. So it had nothing to do with Putin. It was all about the hostility to the energy sector and the reckless spending and the money printing. So when we see the cutbacks in spending, but more importantly, deregulating the energy industry, that's going to bring energy prices down, which affects fertilizer, it affects food prices, it affects really every major part of the economy.
Well, I mean, your analysis there is really very interesting. I hope it turns out to be that way. But, I mean, just moving away slightly from the economy, I mean, he said in that speech that he's going to get hold of Greenland one way or another. I mean, doesn't that come across to you as a return to American imperialism?
Yeah, it's very provocative. That's his nature. Does he really think we're going to, invade Greenland? Of course not. And I don't think you can even acquire Greenland. Last time I looked, it wasn't for sale. But what it means is he is driven to have a much stronger partnership with Greenland. That could mean additional military bases. We already have a significant Air Force base in Greenland that we pay for, of course. And there'll be more of that. And then there'll be the development in the economy, especially around critical minerals, rare earth elements, and oil and gas. So the people of Greenland will probably welcome that. I've talked to an MP there who's very, very positive on the idea of doing more with the United States. They don't want to be part of the United States or owned by the United States, nor do they want to be owned by Denmark, which they've been basically a colony, or for lack of a better word, of Denmark for a long time. So, they really would rather be independent, but with a very close partnership, both in terms of defense and security, as well as economically with the United States.
The point, of course, is that this is the President of the United States. He's the most powerful politician in the world, and his words matter tremendously. I mean, doesn't he have a responsibility to say responsible things?
Yes, he does. And I think he tends to use hyperbole. That's part of his nature. He tends to be aggressive. And so it's part of the businessman, the business type president. We haven't had one of those in generations, or perhaps in 30 years, where we've had a successful businessman be president. It's not completely unprecedented, but he is a deal maker. So he perhaps asks for a bigger number, like we all do in business. You aim for a higher number, you settle somewhere in the middle. Yeah, so that's a different kind of president. It's a much more transactional type of arrangement. But it's also quite refreshing and extremely transparent. He's had more press conferences in 43 days than Joe Biden had in 4 years. So he's not doing anything without letting the American public know what he's up to.
So, I mean, you could say a more emboldened Mr. Trump, testing the boundaries of power. Of course, he can't run again, and that gives him 4 years to deliver on his big, bold promises. Can the momentum be maintained? Can he pull off that blitz of action?
I think so, because he's really been impressive so far. Look at what they tried to do to him in his 4 years out of power. They indicted him 4 times in criminal court. Several other additional times in civil court. That he was, attempted assassination on 2 occasions that we know about. And then the absolute hatred on the far left, as well as from much of the media. The censorship, the Russia collusion hoax, the 51 intelligence officers. I mean, he's had everything thrown against him. So I think he is emboldened, and that's one of the reasons he was elected in November, is because people saw what the system was trying to do to him, what the bureaucracy and the embedded Washington unelected administrative state was trying to do to him. And it's pretty powerful. So he does feel emboldened. Typically, presidents in their second term don't achieve as much as the first term. I think it's the opposite this time around. Whether he can keep up the pace of the first 43 days for 4 years, that would be challenging, I think. But I wouldn't put it past him. Everybody's been surprised at his resilience, especially in the face of all these conspiracies against him. And good for him for fighting back and winning. So far, so good. I think the American people love it. It's a difficult communication, kind of a communication method that doesn't, people aren't used to it in the world. I think in America, we're used to it because he's been at it for 9 years. And also, even the media in the US has become accustomed to it. So we don't get all excited when he says something like, we're going to take Greenland somehow or another. We don't take it that literally, but more importantly, we understand that he's all about outcomes. So if we think that the economy is going to grow, and we think that there'll be some expansion in energy and critical minerals, whether it's in Ukraine or Greenland or in the United States, we think that's good for us. It's good for the world, and it's good for our partners.
And briefly, do you think he's likely to go too far? I mean, as the Democrats suggest and no doubt hope, and there'll be a backlash?
Yeah, that could happen. It's always a risk in politics. I hope he goes too far. I hope he tries every one of these things, because the system has gotten so out of control. You've seen the examples, and he mentioned some of them last night. It was almost funny. It was almost, so funny, but it wasn't funny. The list of items that we, the taxpayer, have been paying for. Transgender operas in Peru, and all kinds of woke and identity politics preaching around the world, and that's taxpayer dollars that are going to that. So I think we need someone who pushes the envelope, who pushes to the extremes. He'll get pushed back by the institutions that are in place. For example, the Supreme Court today failed to take a case which would have allowed some of the spending cuts to go forward. These are spending cuts that were stopped by the local courts, the district courts in and around Washington. So, the systems are in place to make sure that there are guardrails. And I think he'll push as far as he can. And that's what the American people want right now.
Greg, I want to thank you very much indeed.
Thanks, Charles.
You've really been brilliant and patient with us. Greg Swenson is the Republican strategist and chair of Republicans Overseas UK, and he was talking to me on the line there from London. Thank you very much indeed.